Thanks for joining us on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi.
And the next Speaker of the 118th Congress, Kevin McCarthy.
It took 15 tries, but California Republican Kevin McCarthy is indeed the new Speaker of the House of Representatives after a, to say the least, contentious vote that consumed the global and U.S. political world just last week. But McCarthy is believed to have conceded quite a bit of power and acquiesced to the far-right wing of his party in order to gain the Speaker's gavel. For more about this, we spoke with Seth Baskett, the director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver.
Seth, thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Seth, first of all, before we kind of get into some of the nitty-gritty on this, where would last week's spectacle rank among the crazier political happenings in your memory bank?
It's pretty high up there. I mean, it's, is it the craziest thing that's happened? No, but what was unusual about it was just how public it was. If we think back 4 years to when Nancy Pelosi was coming into the speakership in early 2019, there was actually some resistance to that within her own party. There were a number of members who were not very enthusiastic supporters of hers. She also had a very small majority to deal with. However, she was basically able to deal with that before the first day of Congress, and it was all behind closed doors. There were a series of negotiations. She made some promises. She acquiesced to a few things. And ultimately, when it came time to actually open the Congress and have the vote, it was a very easy confirmation vote for her, and she became Speaker. What we saw last week was a version of that, but very public and far more humiliating, right? I mean, normally, a majority party tries to avoid spectacles like that. They try to avoid public embarrassment. They try to avoid not counting the votes all that well. And, this was just out there for everyone to see.
I guess the other component of what you're saying there as well, in addition to the kind of public spectacle, what we saw, Speaker McCarthy reportedly also had to concede quite a bit of power. And again, there is a degree of speculation to what I'm about to say. We don't know the exact terms of what's been hashed out as of this, but there's been reports that he has conceded that any single congressman or woman could call a snap vote on the speaker's position, along with some major rules concessions as well. Based off of what you've seen, Seth, two questions. One, how unusual is it for a Speaker of the House to concede this much power has been reported? And two, what does it effectively mean for his future tenure as Speaker?
It is somewhat unusual for, to have to concede this much. Basically, it was unusual to have, this fractious a party coming into power, where, you had a set of people that could deprive him of a speaker vote at any moment. And, they were making demands, and he was giving them basically as much as he could. So again, we don't know all the details. My understanding of the concession that simply any one member can essentially call for a vote on his speakership, that's actually been the norm for a lot of the House's history. It was raised to a sort of a 5-vote threshold during Nancy Pelosi's speakership, but it's actually not that unusual. It would be unusual if members were actually calling for the end of their own speaker's term. We might see that this year. I think that's a far bigger risk for McCarthy, just because he has so many fractious members of his own party who are so disgruntled. He could face challenges to his own speakership at any given point. So that's pretty serious. But my impression is a lot of the rules concessions, regardless of those, he was always going to be in a fairly weak position. That is, he has a very small majority. Unlike the Democrats, who also had a very small majority in the last session, the Republican Party is a lot more fractured. You have a group of the House Freedom Caucus and some others who are prepared to bolt from their party on votes just on a wide range of issues, and just don't seem to trust their speaker all that much. So that was already going to make for a tough speakership for him, in which he's, really trying to keep everyone happy and, can't afford to have any enemies within his own party. On top of that, coming on the heels of the speakership of Pelosi, she was unusually good at this. That is, she was a pretty good vote counter, and she always knew where her caucus was at any moment. And it's not clear that McCarthy has that same skill set. That's something that we saw, on that 14th speaker vote last week, where he seemed to think he was cruising for election at that point, only it turned out either he'd miscounted or someone in his caucus lied to him, neither of which speak particularly well for his situation.
And then it led to that, I guess, that disagreement on the House floor, the public one with, I believe, Mike Rogers, the congressman from Alabama, who appeared to confront him. And then that led to the confirming vote late on Friday night. I guess one question, and again, there is a large degree of speculation here and assuming, but the question that keeps popping into my mind is that why would Kevin McCarthy seemingly want this job so badly if he's so powerless and suffered kind of several days of humiliation last week? And to what you're saying, I mean, is it simply power, Seth? Why do you think he wants this so badly?
I mean, in some sense, he's been aiming for leadership pretty much his whole career in the Congress. And it is the big brass ring. And you can be very influential in that role. Even a very hampered speaker is still the Speaker of the House and can still do a lot to shape the institution. For a lot of it, I'm not sure why anyone would want the job. I mean, he saw in his own party, John Boehner, who was, I think, had a lot of skills for the job. It still ate him. His own caucus was very hard to manage and ultimately sort of, ended his term. It didn't do Paul Ryan any favors. Part of it is that, like, it is being in charge of a very, narrow majority that is so fractured is it's hard to find someone who even wants to do the job. Right. I mean, one of the best things defending him is that, it's not clear who his opponents would come up with next, who could also get a majority or, of the House. So it's hard to find someone who even wants to do it, who has the skill set to count the votes and manage the floor and do everything else. It's still if you're in the House that long, I think it's still a pretty good perk, even if it's going to be a lot of work for him.
Fair enough. And again, that is speculative. So maybe a bit more looking forward. What do you think the next 2 years of House rule under the Republicans will look like based off of what we saw last week? Do we have any kind of clear glints off of that, or is it still to be determined?
I mean, one of the things that last week tells us is that, the next few years are going to be pretty tough for Speaker McCarthy. That is, he clearly has this group of, around 19 or 20 Republicans who don't seem to trust him and are clearly ready to bolt on a lot of things that the House normally just needs to pass. There is a budget that will come up in the fall. There is, the raising of the House, or excuse me, the raising of the federal borrowing limit that will probably come up sooner than that, probably sometime this summer. These are pretty standard things that, Congress just simply needs to do, but they can be held up by, someone who wants to deprive the House of a majority. And I think we've seen a lot of the same characters who will do that, who simply want to rein in federal spending or, don't want to see the federal government spending things that it's spending on, and are willing to draw a lot of attention to themselves and, maybe cause some real damage on their way to doing that. So there'll be a lot of that on a lot of votes to come. We could be seeing some of that on the rules package that is coming before the House right now.
And reportedly, Tony Gonzalez, at least one Republican, is against that rules package. And again, we'll get more clarity on this in the coming days and weeks. I guess, Seth, is there any way that you see things getting perhaps a little more moderate, maybe where last week was more of a blip? Can maybe perhaps Republican moderates, Don Bacon, Mike Lawler, do something to counter the kind of more extreme wing of the party?
I mean, one of the things that is possibly better news is that, even if this House were very productive, They still are dealing with a Democratic-controlled Senate. They're still dealing with a Democratic-controlled White House. Very little that they're likely to agree on was likely to become law anyway. So it will be difficult for them to work with the other party on the things that they need to work with them on. But they will probably pivot to, other congressional tasks that they are simply more comfortable agreeing on as a party caucus. That could be things like oversight of the executive branch, of conducting lots of hearings and investigations. They have been itching to do that for a long time. It wouldn't shock me if this ended up becoming like an impeachment inquiry into President Biden, regardless of what the reason is. It is something that a vast chunk of the new House majority agrees on, and might be less divisive than actually trying to legislate.
Will there be anything that a Republican-led House could agree on with a Democratic-led Senate and president, or do you expect just a ton of gridlock?
You could see some agreement on, possibly on foreign policy, where there aren't as many international disagreements across party lines. We could see, one of the things that was sort of surprising in, the last few years of President Trump's term is that, when the pandemic started up and there was a massive economic shutdown, both parties actually were able to work pretty well together across party lines in what was an emergency situation. They channeled a lot of funding toward, both health remediation and toward economic assistance for people. And just simply dealing with an emergency, they were actually fairly productive. We don't know if we're going to see those sorts of emergencies in the next year or two, but, on some situations, even parties this polarized are capable of working together.
I guess it's reasonably encouraging, maybe the way I'd want to end things. But Seth, anything final to add about this wide-varying topic of Kevin McCarthy's new term here as Speaker of the House?
Nothing I can think of.
Well, I like it because that way we close things out on perhaps a slightly optimistic tone. But Seth Masket, the director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver and a political science professor at DU as well. Thanks so much for joining us here on 90s Plus. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.